September 24th, 1950 is an innocuous date. It was a typical day, except that it wasn't, not for large swaths of the Great Lakes region, including our own neck of the woods, particularly those of us east of the Susquehanna and north of Route 422. Though nearly forgotten, September 24th, 1950 is sometimes referred to as Black Sunday by those who were around for the day, and those who have heard their stories. I hadn't heard of Black Sunday until a few years back when a friend of mine from work told me the story, as he'd heard it from his father, who was a young guy living near the Mercer-Crawford County border. I'm getting ahead of myself a little now, but the bottom line is this friend, who we'll call Brian, because that is his name, told me about the story a couple of times. He was not sure of the date exactly, but he began to collect as much information as he could find published on the topic, including the date, September 24th, 1950, and the various conspiracies pertaining to it. This ultimately culminated in the purchase of a book, an oral history of the day, collected and assembled by Betty Madison Rhodes and published in 2012. If you can find her Black Sunday, What Really Happened That Day on September 24th, 1950, it's more than worth the price of the admission. So let's get to it. Black Sunday, the day the sun went black. The first time I'd heard about the day the sun went black was from Brian, whose father had told him about it. Brian's father, himself a fairly young man that day, recalled vividly how he'd been looking at some rocks that appeared yellow, a sulfur yellow color. He did not recall smoke, smell, or anything like that, just that the day got very dark. Decades after the fact, he remembered too that there was some debate as to what had happened that day. I'm probably forgetting some of what I had been told, but this is over the course of some years and several conversations about the subject. But I was interested. September 24th, 1950 was a Sunday, and I think this has been established already, but it's really late at night and I'm prone to repeat myself. Anyhow, the high for today, as reported by WJET in Erie, was to be in the upper mid-40s. There was an afternoon ball game in Cleveland between the Detroit Tigers and the Cleveland Indians. People in southern Ontario, northeast Ohio, and Pennsylvania's northern tier began to notice that the sky was taking on a yellow hue by late that morning. One person recalling her experiences living in Erie said that when looking at the houses in town, they looked as though they were wrapped in a yellow cellophane. By 1 o'clock, the field lights were on at Cleveland Stadium, the sky being too dark to continue the game without them. Pitcher Bob Lemon hit a home run in the bottom of the fourth for a Cleveland victory 2-1 over the Detroit Tigers. It extended their streak to 5 games. A similar thing occurred at Pittsburgh's Forbes Field about an hour later. It was the first time that the field lights were turned on so early in the afternoon. It didn't matter though, as the Cincinnati Reds crushed the Pirates 7-1. Some described it as a creeping darkness. An eyewitness in Newcastle, Lawrence County, noted that there was no wind nor any smell. The sky just gradually became yellow and the sun more orange. Before 3 that afternoon, it was as though the sun had set. The Bradford Landmark Society, a historic group dedicated to the history of Bradford, McKean County in Pennsylvania's northern tier, recalled the atmosphere in the city that day.
The blackout started in Bradford about 2:30 p.m. and continued for 2 hours. Birds went to roost and streetlights came on. Everyone stood outside and looked at the sky. The local Bell telephone office was flooded with calls relating to the blackout of the sun. Company officials estimated that 400 to 500 calls an hour were received at the local office during the 2-hour blackout. Everyone had an opinion as to its cause. The most popular theory was that the Army was testing smoke screens by laying them over a huge area. Some theorized that the Russians had something to do with the situation.
Around 5 o'clock in the evening, the darkness began to lift, and by 6, it was more or less done over most areas. The sun rose the next day without issue. There did not seem to be any lingering effects, colors, or smells in the sky. The account from Bradford is not unusual. Recollections state that many people thought it was the end of days, either for eschatological reasons or because of the ever-heating Cold War, which in 1950 was still a novelty. Personally, I have a difficult time believing that all but the craziest or most isolated of people truly thought that the world was coming to an end. Not only because I think that most reasonable people living in 1950 would be more apt to suspect a forest fire or some sort of solar or meteorological event. Hell, even the possibility of mutually assured destruction does not seem that far-fetched considering the relative new fears of the newly anointed atomic age. But this is not an event that occurred at the dawn of human understanding, and I would like to think that were some divine powers involved in play, that the end of days would be a little more dramatic than an early sunset. I'm also doubtful because I grew up hearing about Orson Welles' radio play, The War of the Worlds, causing a bunch of havoc as people across America were convinced that Martians were truly invading the planet. They weren't. And what's more, nearly nobody believed that the Halloween 1938 broadcast of the Mercury Theater was a newscast. Radio surveys of that night suggest that less than 2% of listeners actually tuned into the entirety of the show. The resulting hype was introduced by Orson Welles and CBS for ratings purposes. It was all a great advertising gimmick, and we're still repeating the punchline. There was no hysteria in the wake of the War of the Worlds. You've been lied to all your life, and not just about that. Anyway, I think this remembered insistence that people were convinced of the impending Armageddon during Black Sunday is pretty much the same thing. That being said, a lot of people did wonder if there wasn't some association with the Cold War that was going on. It was only 5 years earlier that the world witnessed the aftermath of the atomic explosions at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And there were fairly regular atomic tests going on with this new generations of weapons over in the US's Marshall Islands, particularly Bikini Atoll. Across the world, the Korean War was in full effect. And that world of 1950 was much larger than today. Most people in northern Pennsylvania got their news from radio, newspapers, or film newsreels, which were in their waning years. In fact, there was only one television station in Erie which began broadcasting in early 1949. Pittsburgh's KDKA began television broadcasts the same year, and the oldest television station would be Philly's. Well, the oldest television station in Pennsylvania is Philly's WPTZ, whose call sign has changed at least once since it began broadcasting television in 1932. With this in mind, it's not hard to imagine someone in Corry up in Erie County or Coudersport in Potter County looking out at the sky and wondering if the Soviets hadn't hit Buffalo, Cleveland, Erie, or Pittsburgh. Other people felt something must have occurred at a test facility of our own. Some of the earliest atomic tests occurred in Pennsylvania, north of Clearfield in Clearfield County. There are other theories about a military-related experiment, such as cloud seeding in order to create blackout for defensive purposes. There are public documents available online via University of Washington's digital collections regarding the United States Department of Commerce Weather Bureau's Artificial Cloud Nucleation (ACN) project. Other countries, including the United Kingdom, had similar cloud seeding programs in effect, aimed on weather manipulation. And because it was 1950, there are people who today state that many people wondered at that time if the goings-on weren't extraterrestrial in nature, and it is certainly an appealing story, which I guess some people will always be putting forward. But as in with the end of the world scenario, I'd expect something more from aliens. But this was a period of time when there was a growing interest in the possibility of extraterrestrial encounter, and perhaps some people at the time really did believe that this was indicative of some such thing. Bear in mind that the most famous UFO incident had occurred not quite 3 full years earlier over in Roswell, New Mexico. So what really happened? 1950 was a hot, dry year in Western Canada. There were numerous wildfires burning throughout Alberta, British Columbia, and by mid-September 1950, the largest of these fires, the Chinchaga Fire, burned between 3,500,000 and 4,200,000 acres, and it may remain the largest recorded wildfire in North American history for some time. The origins of the Chinchaga Fire are thought to be human, but who and how is not exactly certain. What is known is that the fire started early in June and it hit its peak in mid-September, having been allowed to burn more or less uncontrolled because the Canadian resources were kind of spread thin with other wildfires, and because being positioned in the boreal belt of northern Canada, the fire was far away from any population centers. It subsequently scorched its way across the British Columbian border in a northeastern direction into northern Alberta, releasing an unprecedented amount of smoke high into the atmosphere. When the boreal fire was at its most intense period that September, would become known as the Great Smoke Pall of 1950. The smoke rose high into the atmosphere and was traveling along that same northeastern trajectory as the fire. When the atmospheric conditions caused the cloud to dip southward over the Great Lakes region, New York, Ohio, the province of Ontario, and Pennsylvania were the most effective. In fact, there were planes in Ohio and Michigan that were actually grounded. This was true in Ontario as well. Because of the elevation of the smoke, few people which it passed over in this region reported smelling any unusual odors, such as smoke. In the fall of 2008, Canadian Smoke newsletter, I'm not making this up, you can actually find it online, people, Robert Fields from the Department of Physics at the University of Toronto wrote that the smoke plume was tracked across Canada and here in the United States by Harry Wexler, at that time being the Chief of Scientific Services Division of the U.S. Weather Bureau, and perhaps best remembered as the guy who first flew an aircraft into a hurricane for data collection, which he did in 1944. Dr. Fields' article states that Wexler
commissioned a survey of smoke observations across the United States showing that the plume reached as far south as Florida. Over the eastern United States, the plume appeared to be split in two, with one part becoming entrained in a stagnant anticyclonic circulation over southeastern United States until September 29th, creating widespread discoloration. Wexler also estimated that the reflection and absorption of sunlight by the smoke reduced surface temperatures over Washington by up to 4 degrees Celsius. Amazingly, there were no reports across North America of poor air quality at the surface, whereas a surface inversion normally traps pollution. In this case, a dome of cold polar air had protected the cities below from the thick smoke above.
In the end, despite the exceptional size of the Chinchaga Fire, those of us here in Pennsylvania were far too removed from it, not only because it was occurring in an extremely remote section of Canadian wilderness, but also because the effects of it were too high up to be recognizable. The strange atmospheric events recalled by many who were mere children nearly 70 years ago would be hard to reconcile with due to it being such a rare occurrence, and the uncertainty felt by them and those around them that day lingered and metastasized the mystery of the day, arrested and ever larger. Despite the distance of the fires and the size of the world back in 1950, the events of northwestern Canada and their connection to the dark skies of September 24th were reported by news outlets in the Commonwealth, even the more rural areas of Pennsylvania's northern tier. But still, it was an era of uncertainty and suspicion. It was a brave new post-World War II world with new technologies and enemies, And is it really any surprise a lot of people were to remain unsatisfied and unconvinced by the explanation of a fire? A one-off military experiment gone wrong is neither unprecedented nor unlikely. It was only a few years earlier that the United States military was training bats to firebomb Japanese towns, and no, I'm not making that up either. You can read about the disastrous bat bomb tests at Carlsbad Army Airfield Auxiliary Air Base. Taking all that in, as time goes on, there's no reason to suspect that there won't always be a sizable portion of people who have heard of Black Sunday who will continue to wonder what really caused the sun to go black.